Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Khan Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Before we do that, you watching this now, like, subscribe, write a comment now. We're not moving anywhere. Yeah. I'll put up my coffee in the meantime. Yeah. Yeah, I don't care if you've got to sign in or not. Cool. Yeah, sign in. Yeah, go on the thing. There you go. Yeah, subscribe. Like the video, yeah? And when you've done that, any other video that you watch, do the same, okay? Cool. Back to the video. Right, thank all of you who liked and subscribed and who are going to write a comment on this. So, we're going to get now into the video. So, I know that you guys looked at the title and thought this might be clickbait. And I'm trying as much as possible for it not to come across that way, but it is a thing of there is a looming crisis which is on our hands and no one is talking about, and that is the debt crisis that we're facing in the Western world right now. And all the stats that I have here are before the current crisis, yeah? So, current crisis, you guys all know what I'm on about. It's the impact of this crisis in economic terms we can't even begin to measure yet, right? I'm recording this now in August of 2020. We still don't know the full impact of this, but governments across the world have put trillions and trillions of pounds into like just trying to keep the economy afloat during this time, okay? So if you think that, there is, that money, we can't ask Santa for that money, okay? Somehow that money has got to come from somewhere. So in this video, we're going to have to look at some of the potential places where we can get that money back from. Right, so as we discussed in the previous video about economics, yeah, and definitely check that out on the channel. So in that, we spoke about GDP, amongst other things, of course. But when we talk about GDP, if we're talking about debt in relation to GDP, the total amount of government debt that the UK government has is the equivalent of 87% of GDP. Okay, that is a significant amount. In America, the US government has a national debt of 108%. So the US government has got more debt than the entire it's the equivalent, is more than their entire economy is worth. That's how much debt they are in. Never mind all the other countries in Europe and in Japan. Japan, before all of this, had over 200% of the GDP in government debt, and this is pretty much the picture across most of the Western world. You've got very, very high levels of government debt. This is the most debt that we've had since a little bit after World War II, and that's as a result of World War II. Obviously, we needed huge amounts of government spending in the war effort, and it took decades to pay that debt down. So we're in a situation now that we haven't been in most of our lifetime, okay? This is huge. Never mind what we're also going to be talking about. So we've got government debt, we've got consumer debt, and then we've got corporate debt. So consumer debt in the UK, it's at 87%. In the US, it's at 76%. Okay. So that means that people maxing out on a credit card. That means people spending on all manner of things. Like buying Gucci bags and Louis Vuittons and all that kind of stuff, right? And it's people are essentially living well beyond their means. They're not saving much, and they're running up a huge amount of credit on things. Now, some of that is necessary, of course. Like, if people lose their jobs and they need a little bit of extra money, if people are taking out mortgages on their homes, then some consumer debt is necessary. But it's a situation where at this level, it's becoming unsustainable. Never mind again what the effect of lockdown may have been on that. And then finally, we're going to have to talk about corporate debt in the UK and the US, right? So in the UK, corporate debt is at 84%, and in the US, it's at 75%. And all these figures, by the way, just a reminder, this is before the current crisis that we're facing right now. So before COVID, yeah, this is the effect of, this is where we were at already. Okay, this is 10 years after the last recession. Sorry, more than 10 years after the last recession, and yet this is some of the struggles that we were facing anyway. And the news didn't talk about it, but this is a huge issue underlying lots of different things, okay? And it could get very serious very quickly, and no one's really paying attention to it. Right, so if we add up those three figures, yeah, we're talking about government debt, consumer debt, and corporate debt in the US and the UK, we find a grand total of 258% for the UK and 259% for the US. This level of debt is insane. This level of debt cannot be paid down in any short amount of time. This is something that will take a generation or two to pay down, right? And do you see anything from any of our politicians trying to pay it down? On top of that, you know, we know that for the UK, government debt has gone up to almost 100% of GDP because of the bailouts for the coronavirus. Yeah, so that's an extra £300 billion. Yeah, taking our national debt in the UK to 2 trillion. That's a 2 with 12 zeros after it, okay? Just for those of you who like are struggling to think what 2 trillion actually looks like. So that's the current thing that we're at the moment. Never mind the US, which put hundreds of billions of pounds into their bailout, and it's insane. Like no one is really looking at this, because debt is something which tends to hit people over time, and it's not something that is really scary and really blah blah blah, but it's at any point it can be. And before we get into all that, we're gonna have to like and subscribe. Yes, you're enjoying the video. Yeah, I know you're watching still. Yeah, like and subscribe, okay? Comment in there, say what a great video this is, or rah, this is boring, or da 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 da. No, actually, no, don't say it's boring, because obviously it's not boring. And if it is boring, well, then you small brain. So get big brain like me.
But Kwame, though, I don't understand. I mean, interest rates are at a record low rate. Like, what's the problem? Like, I mean, it's at 0.1% in the UK and 0.25 in the US. Like, come on, man, take a chill pill. Like, what the hell?
Now, to whoever that was going to be, yeah, a lot of people have this weird thing that interest rates are really low, and therefore we should just chill and just like make the most of it. Yeah, this is what really typifies short-term thinking, right? Because interest rates are at historic lows now, and the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve in the US, and all the other central banks, because they're even floating the idea of negative interest rates, right? So instead of you having to, you know, it'd be like the equivalent of if you had money in the bank, instead of the bank giving you interest, you're having to pay the bank for the privilege of that, right? So if they start going down the road of negative interest, it's a thing of our debtors would somehow owe us rather than us owing our debtors, or something like that. It's before this crisis, negative interest rates weren't even considered a thing. They were seen as like some theoretical nonsense, yeah. But yeah, essentially, the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve have both floated those ideas. So, you know, but the thing is, if it goes back to historic averages, then we're in a massive problem, right? the interest rate average for the UK alone, for the Bank of England interest rate over time, the average is about 5%. So it's at 0.1% now. But if it jumps up to 5%, we've got problems. Yeah, that's what? Do the maths? That's a 50% increase, right? So that would mean us going from paying 2 billion to 100 billion, right? Never mind if it goes to historic average, there's historic highs in this country of 17%, then we'd be paying £340 billion a year just on paying down the debt. That's insane. And that's not all the other debts we talk about. As we're talking about government debt, that is how much taxpayers, this is how much our government would have to pay if it went back to historic average or to historic highs. Just because it's low at the moment does not mean that it's going to stay like that. Even if it jumps up to 2%, we have a problem. If it jumps up to 5%, we've got an even bigger problem. If it jumps up even higher than that, hey, I don't know what happens then. It's and the same in the US. Yeah, it's 0.25 now, but historically the highs of the Federal Reserve interest rate went all the way up to 20%. So you do the maths on that. That's a huge interest, right? That's a huge increase. That's a 80. It's increased at that point 80-fold, right? So don't just think that, oh, it's fine at the moment, because at any point interest rates could rise and then we are stuffed. Now, of course, not all debt is bad. Of course, sometimes the government needs to have some debt. In the same way as we discussed earlier, consumers need debt, corporations need debt. There's a certain level of debt which is sometimes necessary and really help us out. If it wasn't for debt, we wouldn't have been able to win the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, any major like conflict, yeah, right, requires governments to take out huge amounts of debt in order to pay for them, right? Never mind, we're in a basic war at the moment, yeah, like kind of against the virus, right? So it's a worldwide pandemic, yeah, and so it's a pandemic, and so it's the thing of we are trying our best to deal with it and with all the after effects of it. And so yeah, there's an argument for, yes, we have to increase the amount of debt that we have, but we have to really think about the fact that there is, to turn a phrase, there is no magic money tree, right? And a lot of people at the moment are saying, well, governments at the moment are spending money which before they said they didn't have. The truth is that we didn't have it then, and we don't really have it now. And as much as this money is getting created now, it does and spent in things. It doesn't mean that this can go on indefinitely for a long amount of time. Everything has a consequence, right? You can't take out a loan without having to pay that loan back. There is a very good argument, for taking out debt, even like in a financial sense, right? If you take out debt to help pay for to basically do an investment, then that makes perfect sense, right? But if the amount of interest you're having to pay back on that debt outweighs the benefit from that investment, that's when it's problematic. And that is coming very close to the situation we're in at the moment, where the amount of debt that we've accrued from this crisis, from the 2008 crisis, from all the other crises that our governments haven't managed properly, from all the consumer spending and the credit card spending that we've been doing over the last 30 years, all of this is now adding up, and it's a situation where at some point there is going to have to be a reckoning. And it could be this year, it could be next year, it could be 10 years from now, we don't know when, but it's a thing of we can't just bury our head in the sand and hope that this problem will go away. It's not going away, and there are going to be consequences to it. And on top of that, not all of our debt is in the hands of nice people who are happy to allow us to pay the debt back at a later time. China and the West at the moment are at loggerheads, and at the moment a large amount of government debt is both in the UK, the US, and many other places is owned by China. And what we're seeing in country after country is China giving money to countries, whether it be Sri Lanka, whether it be loads of different places, right? And they are then using that as leverage against said country, right? They're saying, right, you owe us X amount of debt, you can't afford to pay this back, right? We want a military base out of you, we want this out of you, we want this, etc., right? Now, at the moment, China has a huge economy. China's economy is growing at a huge rate, and their power and influence is spreading. And so, if Western countries are not careful, the same things that China are doing to developing nations are the same things that they could do to developed nations, right? And that's something that, again, we've slept-walked into. And only now are some politicians beginning to see the huge impact of that threat. And for any of you who have seen the film Mean Streets, right? It's really a great film, but they have loan sharks in that, right? And within that, you have people, they loan you money. This is what mobsters do. They loan you money, and if you can't pay it back because they're charged some high interest rate, watch out, because then you've got a problem on your hands, right? And that essentially might be what we have done with some of our debt right now, and it's might get a bit dicey. Might just get a bit dicey. Right, so I just want to segue this with a little bit of history, actually, because if we're talking about debt, we have to talk about it kind of in its totality, right? So, historically, debt was seen as something which, well, it was banned in many religions, right? So, putting interest on debts were banned within Islam and within the early Christian church. Yeah, it was a thing of the practice was banned as well. So within medieval Europe and the Middle East, it was a thing where the only people who were allowed to loan money for interest ended up being Jews, right? And this is where the negative stereotypes of Jews, many anti-Semitic people will come up with stereotypes of them being like money grabbing and etc., right? Really, we will do a future video on the history of anti-Semitism, so definitely stay tuned for that. But I just want to bring a story that many of you may have come across before. So within Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, the character Shylock is represented as a moneylender, and the character within that, he takes money out, and then what Shylock demands of him is a pound of flesh, right? So ignoring the incredibly problematic connotations within the problematic nature of that Shakespeare play, it's a thing where the symbolism within it is still there, that essentially hostile powers, if you are in debt to them, can take either a physical or metaphorical pound of flesh from you, okay? So that's another reason why if you're going to go into debt, never take out more debt than you can afford to pay back, and be very mindful of who you're taking money from. So we're going to have to start looking now at some solutions for how to pay down the debt crisis. And in reality, it's a thing where what is being taken at the present time, and I predicted this actually. I remember having a conversation with my dad, a few days before this happened, and I was like, I reckon that the Federal Reserve and that the Bank of England are going to start doing inflation to try and deal with this debt crisis. Lo and behold, what we find, the Federal Reserve raised the amount of inflation, and I believe the Bank of England is soon to follow, right? So, what is inflation? Well, we're going to discuss this more in depth in the next video, which is going to be about the history of money. So, for now, we'll just touch on it very, very, very briefly. So, inflation, you print more money, put more money into the money supply, the value of the money goes down. that means that if you owe debt, then the amount that you actually have to pay back is decreased. So just on a very simple thing, if you owe someone £100 now, in X amount of years' time, you only have to pay back the equivalent of £50 worth, right? If it's if the inflation rate is that high, because the money has been devalued that much, it's a thing where you're actually paying back less. So typically, this has been what a lot of governments have done. We saw this in the post-war world, where our governments had huge levels of inflation to try and pay down their debt. You see this in Weimar Germany, just after World War One, where they had record levels of like hyperinflation to try and pay down their debts. And you saw this in post-war Hungary. You see this in present-day Zimbabwe. You see it in so many places in Venezuela, where I believe that their currency is now valued at less than World of Warcraft money. Apparently, that was a few years ago. It may have changed since then, but long story short, if you start going down the road of inflation, you have to be very, very careful it doesn't spiral out of control and become hyperinflation, because then all the people who have been sensible, who have been saving properly during this time, they are going to be the ones who lose out, because the money that they've been able to save is now worth less than it was before. So it's very good for the people who have been frivolous with their spending, but it's very bad for the people who have done the sensible thing and saved over time and been responsible. Now, another thing that people suggest is that, we can just raise taxes on the rich, and they've got plenty of money, so we'll pay it down that way. The evidence on raising tax rates above a certain threshold on wealthy people, the evidence that it leads to a sudden spike in additional revenue is spurious to say the least. When you actually drill down to the data, from all the data I've seen of it, I see very, very little evidence that above even 40%, or even above 50%, you don't start seeing significant increases in tax revenue coming from that, right? Certainly not enough to pay down the debt. So even if we had it at 70% or 8%, etc., which is, in France a few years ago, they had that idea. They had a wealth tax and they had a tax on income at 75%, and they were quite disappointed to find that it didn't raise the kind of revenue that they were thinking, right? So taxing the rich is not. It's a potential solution, but we shouldn't be naive and assume that it's going to solve all of the solution. And also, in the current situation that we're in, the top 10% pay more taxes than the bottom 90% combined, right? Now you can look at that in terms of income inequality and say that the top 10% earn more than the bottom 90%, but that's beside the point. The point is that the rich are taxed higher than we're getting more out of the rich than we ever had before as a percentage of GDP, and so it's a thing of it's going to be quite difficult to get enough money from them to help deal with this crisis. Another potential solution is to cut spending. But then that's very problematic, because if we tried to in Britain and in many places in Europe, etc., they tried to do austerity, which was where you keep the level of taxation very high and you keep the role of government pretty much the same, but you try and cut down on the amount that is being spent by the government. And economists have pretty much agreed now that austerity, while it slowed the growth of government spending, in actual fact, all it really did is just make government services, public services, worse run, more inefficient. It didn't increase efficiency. It didn't make these services better. It just meant that they were deprived from being able to actually kind of do what they needed to do. So if you're going to cut spending, it requires a whole bigger look at what the role of government ought to be. So in places like, you know, Taiwan, places like Singapore, and places like Hong Kong, they are very small governments, and what I mean by this is that as a percentage of GDP, their governments do not spend as higher rates as they do in many Western places. Switzerland is actually is a Western exception to this rule. Their rates of spending are quite low as well. But most of Europe outside of Switzerland, you know, the government tends to spend about 40% of GDP on government. So it's, whereas in Switzerland and other places, it's more like 25% or thereabouts, right? And many places in the Far East, they spend between 12 and 20%, right? China's about 17% last time I checked, and Singapore and Hong Kong, I believe, were about 12% last time I checked. But these figures always fluctuate, so it's a thing of you have to look at how it changes. Now, Singapore is a very interesting example because in Singapore, they mandate that every single person has to save 20% of their post-tax income. So if they make after tax, they have to put that into a savings account. And that savings account goes towards paying for the people's pensions, goes towards paying medical bills, and it pays towards your child's education. So as a result of, you know, this huge amount of saving, and Singapore's been doing this for many decades, right? So as a result, every person in Singapore, even if they're relatively low paid, has a decent level of money saved up, right? Because you'd be surprised how saving, you know, 20% of your income post-tax, if you're able to do that, you'd be very surprised how much money ends up accruing over a very short amount of time. And over 20 years, over 30 years, over 40 years, it ends up being a significant amount. And that's why Singapore can afford to have a much smaller state, can afford to be much less indebted than the Western world, because people have got the means to take care of themselves because they've been encouraged to save and save and save. The saving rate in the UK, by comparison, is 5% of GDP. In Singapore, last time I checked, I believe it's something like 20% of their income, of their GDP, is in savings, right? So that's significant, right? And that has big implications. In China, their savings rate is almost at 30%, right? So we can see how countries that save a lot are less indebted, and, you know, people who save a lot are less indebted. Because why do you need to take out a loan from a bank or from etc., take out a credit card if you've been saving steadily 20% of your income, 15% of your income, 10%, whatever it is that you can actually manage and stuff, right? Whatever the maximum amount that you can save is, having that stored away, not touching it for many years, actually accrues a huge amount of capital. And so, with that being said, don't forget to like, comment, and if you have not done so already, subscribe to the channel. It only takes a little bit of time, you know, just press it, yeah, and leave it. That's all you got to do. I'm not asking you to run a marathon, just like, subscribe, and if you have any thoughts on the video or on any of the content that I discussed, then give a comment, and stay tuned for the next video, which is going to be talking about money. And why is that ice cream truck going again? Ah! Anyway, sorry about that. But hope you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for next time. Bye.